The crime scene they contaminated. December 26, 1996. 5:52 in the morning. Boulder, Colorado is still dark, still quiet, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air. Most families are asleep, recovering from Christmas celebrations, surrounded by wrapping paper and the remnants of holiday joy. But at 755 15th Street, in a Tudor-style home nestled in one of Boulder's most affluent neighborhoods, Patsy Ramsey is dialing 911. Her voice cracks through the line, frantic, breathless, barely coherent. She's found a ransom note. Her daughter is gone. JonBenet, her 6-year-old daughter, has been taken. The dispatcher tries to calm her down, tries to get details, but Patsy is spiraling. You can hear it in every syllable. The panic of a mother who has just discovered her child is missing. The call lasts less than 6 minutes. In those 6 minutes, everything that follows is set into motion. But here's what we need to understand from the very beginning. This case was compromised before the sun even came up. Before the first officer stepped through the door. Before anyone knew what they were really dealing with. This is the story of how a crime scene was contaminated, how evidence was lost, and how the mistakes made in those first critical hours would haunt this investigation for decades. But more than that, this is a story about what happens when the people who should be most desperate for answers are the ones most desperate to control them. Act 1. The Discovery. When Officer Rick French arrives at the Ramsey home at 5:59 a.m., just 7 minutes after that 911 call, he's expecting a kidnapping. That's what dispatch told him. Ransom note. Missing child. Possible abduction. He walks into a scene that doesn't make sense. John Ramsey meets him at the door. Calm, controlled, almost too composed for a man whose daughter has supposedly just been taken. Patsy is there too, but she's different. She's on the floor near the Christmas tree, wailing, sobbing, her body convulsing with grief. Two parents, two completely different reactions. From a psychological standpoint, this divergence is fascinating. Grief doesn't follow a script. Everyone processes trauma differently. Some people shut down, retreating into a calm, almost robotic state as a defense mechanism. Others collapse entirely, overwhelmed by emotion they can't contain. But here's what we notice when we look at the behavior through a forensic lens. The performance aspect. Not that the grief isn't real, it might be, but that it's being expressed in ways that seem almost theatrical. Patsy on the floor, visible, audible, impossible to ignore. John at the door, the rational one, the one providing information, guiding the officer. It's a division of labor. And whether conscious or unconscious, it creates a dynamic where one parent is too emotional to be questioned effectively, and the other is too controlled to seem suspicious. Officer French does what he's trained to do. He secures the scene. He asks questions. He begins a search of the house. But here's where the logical thread starts to unravel. If this is a kidnapping, if an intruder broke in during the night and took JonBenet, then there should be signs of forced entry. Broken windows, damaged locks, something. Officer French finds nothing. Every door is locked from the inside. Every window is secure. He checks carefully, systematically, because this detail matters. In any home invasion, in any breaking and entering, there's evidence. Criminals leave traces. They jimmy locks, break glass, force doors. The physics of entry creates disturbance. But here, nothing. So the question forms immediately, even if Officer French doesn't voice it yet. How did an intruder get in? The house itself tells a story, if you know how to read it. The Ramsey home is a sprawling 7,000 square foot Tudor with multiple levels, numerous rooms, winding hallways, staircases that connect different sections. It's the kind of house where you could get lost if you didn't know the layout intimately. And that's the anthropological detail that matters here. This isn't a simple ranch-style home with straightforward access. This is a complex structure with multiple entry points, yes, but also multiple layers of navigation. An intruder unfamiliar with the house would struggle. They'd make noise. They'd open wrong doors, bump into furniture, lose time trying to orient themselves. But according to the supposed timeline, this intruder knew exactly where to go. They found JonBenet's room on the second floor. They took her down to the basement. They found paper and a pen in the kitchen. They navigated a house in the dark without leaving evidence of confusion or error. That level of familiarity suggests someone who'd been there before. Someone who knew the family. Someone who belonged. Officer French doesn't have all these pieces yet. He's still in the early stages, still gathering information. But the questions are already forming, and they don't point toward a stranger in the night. He conducts an initial search of the house. Quick, methodical, checking rooms, closets, anywhere a child might be hiding or might have been hidden. He goes down to the basement. The basement is partially finished, with several rooms, storage areas, a boiler room. It's cluttered with the accumulation of family life. Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes of belongings. He checks several rooms. He even tries the door to the wine cellar, but it's latched from the outside. The latch is a simple wooden block on a screw, the kind you turn to secure a door. It's in the closed position. And here's the deductive reasoning that guides his decision. If the door is latched from the outside, no one can be inside. You can't latch a door from the outside if you're trapped inside the room. It's a physical impossibility. So Officer French moves on. This will haunt him for years, because JonBenet is in that room. Her body is just feet away from where he's standing. But the latch tells him no one could be in there. And in the chaos of a possible kidnapping, with a ransom note upstairs and parents saying their child has been taken, he doesn't have time to check every latch door. He's looking for signs of an intruder, signs of a struggle, signs of where JonBenet might have been taken. He doesn't find her because he's operating on the assumption that what he's been told is true. She's been taken out of the house, but she never left. Officer French completes his search and returns upstairs. He finds nothing. JonBenet is not in the house. At least, that's what he believes. So his focus shifts to the ransom note, to the possibility that this really is an abduction, that JonBenet has been taken somewhere else. He reads the note, and even on first reading, things don't add up. The note is long, absurdly long for a ransom demand. It's written on 3 pages of paper from a notepad found in the Ramsey kitchen. The handwriting is consistent, not rushed or panicked. There are crossouts, corrections, as if the writer had time to compose and edit. And the content? It's bizarre. It claims to be from a foreign faction. It references John's business. It makes movie references, lines that sound like they came from action films. It warns the family not to contact police or FBI, threatens that JonBenet will be harmed if they don't follow instructions exactly. And yet, here's Officer French, standing in the house, called by the family themselves. The note said, "Don't contact authorities." The first thing Patsy did was call 911. From a logical standpoint, this creates a contradiction. If you truly believe your child has been taken by dangerous criminals who've explicitly warned you not to involve police, do you immediately call police? Or do you wait? Do you follow the instructions, terrified that any deviation will cost your child her life? The Ramseys didn't wait. They called immediately. Officer French doesn't voice these concerns yet. He's still processing, still trying to establish facts. But the inconsistencies are stacking up. And this is where the chaos begins. Because while Officer French is trying to secure a crime scene, the Ramseys are making phone calls. Patsy calls friends, the Whites, the Fernies. John calls his pilot, makes arrangements to fly to Atlanta later that day. Within an hour, the house is filling up with people. Friends arrive with food, with comfort, with support. Father Ol Hoverstock, the family's pastor, comes to pray with them. Fleet and Priscilla White, close family friends, arrive and immediately start helping. John Fernie and his wife come to sit with Patsy. It's a well-meaning gathering, the kind of community response you'd expect when a family is in crisis. But from an investigative standpoint, it's a disaster. Every person who walks through that door is a contamination risk. Every surface they touch, every room they enter, every conversation they have is potentially destroying evidence. Crime scene integrity depends on isolation. You secure the scene, you limit access, you document everything before anyone moves anything. That's basic forensic protocol. But here, within the first hour, there are a dozen people moving through the house. They're walking on carpets that might hold fiber evidence. They're touching doorknobs that might hold fingerprints. They're sitting on furniture, using bathrooms, making coffee in the kitchen. And no one is documenting who's where, who's touching what, who's moving through which rooms. From a forensic standpoint, the scene is being destroyed in real time. But from a psychological and anthropological standpoint, this tells us something crucial about how the Ramseys were processing the situation. In most kidnapping cases, families isolate. They sit by the phone. They wait in terrified silence for the ransom call. They're afraid to breathe wrong, afraid to do anything that might jeopardize their child's safety. But the Ramseys filled their house with people. They created a social environment, a gathering, almost a vigil. And in doing so, they created witnesses. Witnesses who would later testify that Patsy was distraught, that John was worried, that the family was clearly in crisis. Whether intentionally or not, they were establishing a narrative. They were creating the optics of innocent parents whose child had been taken. But that narrative only makes sense if you don't think too hard about what the ransom note said. Because the note didn't say call your friends. It didn't say gather your community. It said don't tell anyone. It said wait for instructions. It said follow the rules or your daughter will be harmed. And the Ramseys did the exact opposite. Unless, of course, they already knew JonBenet wasn't coming back. Unless they already knew the ransom note was fiction. Unless they needed the crowd for reasons that had nothing to do with getting their daughter back safely. Act 2. The contamination. By mid-morning, Detective Linda Arndt arrives. She's been assigned as the lead detective on what everyone still believes is a kidnapping case. She's experienced, competent, prepared to handle a high-stress situation. She walks into the Ramsey home expecting to find a secured crime scene, a family in lockdown, a controlled environment where she can begin to piece together what happened. Instead, she walks into chaos. There are people everywhere. Friends consoling Patsy in one room, John on the phone in another, Father Rowe praying with family members, Fleet White checking on people, Priscilla White making coffee, the Fernie sitting with Patsy, trying to keep her calm. It's a house full of movement, conversation, emotion, and Detective Arndt is alone. She's one detective in a house full of people, and she can feel the situation slipping away from her. She tries to establish some control, tries to get information, tries to keep track of who's coming and going. But the physical reality of the situation is overwhelming. She can't be everywhere at once. She can't monitor every room, every person, every interaction. From a physiological standpoint, this is a stress response situation. Her body is pumping adrenaline. Her mind is working overtime to process information, to assess threats, to maintain situational awareness. But there's a limit to what one person can manage. And she's being asked to manage a scene that should have 6 or 8 officers minimum. She does her best. She stations herself in a central location. She asks questions. She takes notes. She waits for the ransom call that's supposed to come. But she's also watching. And what she's watching doesn't sit right. There's something about the way the family is behaving. Something about the dynamics that feels off. Patsy is still on the floor near the Christmas tree, still sobbing, still surrounded by friends who are comforting her. But there's a performative quality to it. A sense that the grief is being expressed for an audience. And then there's John. Throughout the morning, John Ramsey disappears. Not for a few minutes, for long stretches of time. Detective Arndt loses track of him. She doesn't know where he is, doesn't know what he's doing. In a case where every movement matters, where every action can be evidence, John Ramsey is unaccounted for. She asks where he is. Sometimes people know. He's checking his mail, he's on the phone, he's in another room. Sometimes they don't know. And here's where the philosophical question emerges. What does it mean when a father, whose daughter has allegedly been taken, repeatedly removes himself from the central area where police are stationed? If your child is missing, If you're waiting for instructions that could save her life, wouldn't you plant yourself next to the detective and refuse to move? Wouldn't you want to be present for every update, every development, every piece of information? But John keeps disappearing. And when Detective Arndt later writes her report, she'll note this behavior as significant. She'll describe a feeling she couldn't shake, that she was being managed, that the family's behavior wasn't matching the crisis they were supposedly experiencing. The hours pass. The deadline for the ransom call approaches. According to the note, the call would come between 8 and 10 a.m. Detective Arndt briefs the family. She tells them what to expect, how to handle the call, what to listen for. If the phone rings, they need to keep the caller talking. Get as much information as possible. 8 a.m. comes. No call. 9 a.m. Still nothing. The tension in the house should be unbearable. This is the moment when the supposed captors will make contact, when the family will learn what they need to do to get JonBenet back. But 10 a.m. passes. No call. And here's what's fascinating about this moment from a psychological perspective. The family doesn't seem surprised. There's no escalation of panic, no demands to know why the phone isn't ringing, no breakdown over the fact that the deadline has passed and no one has made contact. It's as if they already knew the call wasn't coming. Because of course, it wasn't. Because there never was a captor to call. Because the note was staging, and the people who wrote it knew perfectly well that no phone was going to ring. But Detective Arndt doesn't know that yet. She's still operating on the assumption that this might be real, that JonBenet might still be alive somewhere, that the investigation needs to continue. She makes a decision that will haunt this case forever. Around 1 p.m., more than 7 hours after the initial 911 call, she tells John Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house again, top to bottom, see if there's anything they missed, anything that might provide a clue. It's a reasonable request. Sometimes evidence emerges on a second look. Sometimes a fresh perspective catches what the first search missed. But what happens next will obliterate any remaining integrity the crime scene had. John and Fleet go down to the basement together. They check rooms they've already checked. They move through the space methodically. And then they reach the wine cellar, the same room Officer French tried earlier that morning, the one with the latch door. John reaches for the latch. Fleet is right behind him watching. Later, Fleet will describe this moment in detail. He'll say that John seemed to know what he was going to find. That there was something about his body language, his movements, that didn't match the surprise of a father discovering his child. John opens the door. The room is dark. The light switch is outside the door. But even in the dimness, they can see it. In the corner of that small windowless room, wrapped in a white blanket, is JonBenet. John screams. It's the sound of a father seeing his child, and the anguish in it is real. Whatever else is true, that sound is real. But what happens next is where the narrative fractures. John Ramsey doesn't wait for police. He doesn't step back and preserve the scene. He doesn't call for Detective Arndt to come see what they found before anything is disturbed. He runs into that room, rips the duct tape off JonBenet's mouth, picks up her body, and carries her upstairs. Fleet White is right behind him, trying to process what he's seeing. He reaches out, tries to tell John to wait, tries to preserve what little integrity the scene has left. But it's too late. John is already moving, already carrying JonBenet up the basement stairs, through the hallway, into the living room. From a forensic perspective, what's happening in this moment is catastrophic. Every crime scene tells a story through spatial relationships. Where the body was found, what position it was in, what items were near it, what the surrounding environment looked like. All of that context is critical for understanding what happened. But by moving the body, John is destroying that context. He's changing the positioning, disrupting the evidence, mixing his DNA and fibers from his clothing with whatever was already there. The white blanket she was wrapped in. That's evidence. It might have fibers, might have DNA, might tell us who handled it and when. But now it's been moved, repositioned, contaminated. The duct tape that was on her mouth, critical evidence. But John ripped it off before anyone could document its exact position, its condition, what might have been preserved on the adhesive. The room itself, the wine cellar where she was found, that's a crime scene within a crime scene. But now it's been compromised by two people walking through it, touching things, disturbing the environment. Every investigator's nightmare is happening in real time. But here's the thing. From a human perspective, what John Ramsey just did makes perfect sense. You find your child, your baby. She's been missing for hours. She's not moving. She's cold. And every instinct in your body screams at you to grab her, to hold her, to bring her close. The parental instinct to protect, even when protection is no longer possible, is overwhelming. So we're left with a question that has no easy answer. Was this the natural, uncontrollable response of a father who just found his daughter? Or was it something else? Because there's another detail that doesn't quite fit. Fleet White, who was standing right there, later described John's demeanor as strange. Not just grief-stricken, but something else. Controlled, even in the chaos. Moving with purpose. And there's the question of the basement itself. John had been down there that morning, during one of his disappearances. He'd been unaccounted for. Detective Arndt didn't know where he was for stretches of time. So when he opens that wine cellar door at 1:05 p.m. and discovers JonBenet, is this really the first time he's seeing her there? Or had he seen her before, earlier that morning, and waited until the right moment to find her with a witness present? It's a dark question, an uncomfortable question, but it's one that investigators have been asking for 29 years. Because the alternative, that John Ramsey genuinely didn't know his daughter was in that basement room for over 7 hours, requires us to believe that an intruder placed her there, latched the door from the outside, and left without anyone noticing. And that belief requires us to ignore a lot of other evidence. John carries JonBenet into the living room and lays her on the floor near the Christmas tree. Detective Arndt sees him coming. She sees the small body in his arms. And in that moment, everything changes. This isn't a kidnapping anymore. This was never a kidnapping. JonBenet has been in the house the entire time. Detective Arndt moves quickly. She checks for signs of life, knowing already there won't be any. JonBenet's body is cold, rigid. She's been gone for hours. The scene around her erupts. Patsy sees her daughter and collapses. Friends are crying, praying, trying to make sense of what's happening. The house that was full of nervous energy, of waiting and hoping, suddenly fills with grief. But Detective Arndt is watching. She's watching John. She's watching the family. She's watching the dynamics. And she's doing math. She counts the people in the house. Counts how many are family, how many are friends, how many are potential witnesses or potential suspects. Then she counts the bullets in her gun. It's a chilling detail, one she'll later share in interviews. She felt in that moment that she needed to be prepared, that she was in a room with people who were controlling the narrative, who were moving pieces on a board she couldn't see. She felt outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and she had a gut feeling that she would later describe in testimony. When John Ramsey looked at her from across that room, she knew, not suspected, knew. She was looking at the person responsible for JonBenet's passing, not some intruder who broke in from outside, not some stranger who targeted the family. The person responsible was already in the house, had been there all along. Now, gut feelings aren't evidence. They don't hold up in court. They don't prove anything. But Detective Arndt's instinct, formed in that moment of chaos and grief, would be echoed by other investigators as the case developed. Because once you start looking at the evidence, really looking at it, without the filter of the intruder narrative, it all points in one direction. And that direction isn't outside the house. It's inside. Act 3. The first red flags. Let's pause here and look at what we know. Let's strip away the emotion, the chaos, the grief, and examine the facts with cold logic. A ransom note was found on the spiral staircase early that morning. It demanded $118,000 for the safe return of JonBenet. It warned the family not to contact police, not to tell anyone, or she would be harmed. It promised a call between 8 and 10 a.m. with instructions for the money drop. But let's apply deductive reasoning to each element of that note. First, the ransom amount. $118,000 is not a round number. Kidnappers usually demand round figures. $100,000, $500,000, $1 million. Numbers that are easy to remember, easy to discuss, psychologically significant. But $118,000? That's oddly specific. And as investigators discovered within hours of beginning their work, it's the exact amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from Access Graphics, the company he ran. Not his salary, not his net worth, his Christmas bonus, a specific payment he'd received just weeks before. How would an intruder know that? This isn't public information. It's not something you'd find by following the family, watching the house, casing the neighborhood. It's not written on a sign outside. It's not in the phone book or public records. It's intimate financial knowledge, the kind of detail only someone inside the family would know. Think about that for a moment. If you were planning a kidnapping, how would you determine the ransom amount? You'd assess the family's wealth, their home, their lifestyle. You'd probably ask for a number that seems attainable but significant. But you wouldn't know the exact amount of a recent bonus payment unless you had access to private financial information. Strike one against the intruder theory. Now let's talk about the note itself. Not just the amount, but the content and construction. The note is 2.5 pages long, handwritten on 3 sheets of paper from a notepad found in the Ramsey kitchen. The handwriting is consistent throughout, not rushed or panicked. There are crossouts where the writer made mistakes and corrected them. There are complete sentences, proper grammar, even punctuation. This is not what ransom notes typically look like. Real ransom notes, the ones written by actual criminals who've taken someone for money, are usually short. A few lines. We have your daughter. $100,000 in unmarked bills. Instructions to follow. Don't call police. Short. Direct. Efficient. Because criminals don't sit in their victims' home writing essays. They don't have time. They don't have the patience. And they don't want to leave evidence. The longer the note, the more handwriting there is to analyze. But this note was written by someone who had time. Someone who felt comfortable enough to sit down, find paper and a pen, draft a lengthy message, make corrections, even add dramatic flourishes. The note references movies, lines that sound like they came from Dirty Harry or Speed or other action films. Don't try to grow a brain. We are a small foreign faction. Use that good southern common sense of yours. These aren't the words of a hardened criminal. These are the words of someone who's watched too many movies about crime and is trying to sound threatening. And then there's the sign-off. Victory. SBTC. 29 years later, no one has definitely figured out what SBTC means. Investigators have theories. Saved by the Cross, Subic Bay Training Center, a reference to John's Navy service, but nothing confirmed. It's the kind of detail that sounds ominous, that seems like it should mean something significant, but ultimately just raises more questions. The whole note is like that. It sounds like a ransom note. It uses the language of a ransom note. But when you examine it closely, it doesn't make logical sense. Why would an intruder spend time writing this note before taking JonBenet? Why not take her first, then send a note later from a safe location? Why write it on paper from the house? Why not bring materials with you to avoid leaving evidence? And here's the detail that investigators found most telling. The notepad the ransom note was written on was found in the kitchen, right where it belonged. The pen used to write the note was also found in the house, placed back in its usual spot. So, the intruder broke in, found JonBenet, took her to the basement, then came back upstairs to write a ransom note, using materials from the house, and then neatly put everything back before leaving. Except they didn't leave, because JonBenet's body was still in the basement. The note doesn't make sense as part of a kidnapping, but it makes perfect sense as staging. It makes sense if someone in the house needed to create a narrative, needed to point investigators away from the family and toward an outside threat. Strike 2. Now let's move to the physical evidence of the house itself. Officer French found no forced entry. This is critical. In almost every home invasion, in almost every breaking and entering, there's physical evidence of how the criminal got in. A broken window, a jimmied lock, a kick-in door, scratches on a doorframe, disturbed dirt outside a window. Something. But here? Every door was locked from the inside. Every window was secure. The house was buttoned up tight. John Ramsey would later point to a basement window as the possible entry point. He claimed he'd broken that window himself months earlier when he was locked out of the house, and that it had never been repaired. But investigators found problems with that story. First, there was no disturbance in the dirt and grime around the window. If someone had crawled through, there would be smear marks, displaced debris, some sign of passage. Second, there was a heavy grate covering the window well from the outside. To access the window, you'd have to move that grate. But the grate was undisturbed, covered in frost and debris that hadn't been touched. Third, even if you could get through the window, you dropped down into a cluttered basement storage area filled with boxes and items. There was no clear path, no evidence that anyone had landed there and moved through the space. And finally, the window itself. Yes, it was broken, but the break was old. The glass fragments were settled. There was no fresh damage, no new disturbance. So the window that John claimed could have been the intruder's entry point doesn't actually support that theory. Which brings us back to the central question: how did the intruder get in? The only logical answers are they had a key or someone let them in. But if they had a key, we're not talking about a random criminal. We're talking about someone with access, someone connected to the family. And if someone let them in, then we're talking about someone the family knew well enough to open the door to in the middle of the night. Either way, the stranger in the night theory collapses. Strike 3. But let's keep going, because the red flags don't stop there. The ransom note said to expect a call between 8 and 10 a.m. Specific instructions would be given. The family was to prepare the money and wait. Detective Arndt was there. The family was there. The phone line was monitored. Every person in that house was on edge, waiting for the call that would tell them how to get JonBenet back. 8 a.m. came and went. Nothing. 9 a.m. Still nothing. 9:30. Silence. 10 a.m. passed. No call. And here's what's fascinating from a behavioral analysis standpoint. There's no panic from the family about this. In a real kidnapping, when the promised ransom call doesn't come, families fall apart. They demand answers. They insist police do something. They spiral into terror because the silence means something has gone wrong. But the Ramseys didn't react that way. There was tension, yes. Worry. But not the escalating panic you'd expect when the supposed captors fail to make contact. It's as if they already knew the call wasn't coming. Because of course, it wasn't. Because there never was anyone to call. Because the note was theater. And the people who wrote it understood that the phone was never going to ring. But Detective Arndt didn't have that context yet. She was still working the case as if it might be real. And then there's the detail that still makes investigators shake their heads nearly 3 decades later. The family's lawyer showed up before 10 a.m. Mike Bynum, a close family friend and attorney, was at the house before the ransom call was even supposed to come. Before the body was found. Before anyone officially knew this was anything other than a missing child case. Why does a family need a lawyer in the first hours of their child's disappearance? Think about that from a psychological perspective. When your child is missing, what's your priority? Bringing them home. Cooperating with police. Doing everything investigators tell you to do because you're terrified that any misstep could cost your child their life. You don't think about legal protection. You don't think about lawyers. You think about your child. But Mike Bynum was there early. And by the end of the day, the Ramseys would have not one but multiple attorneys. By the next day, they would refuse to be interviewed by police. For 4 months, investigators couldn't get John and Patsy Ramsey to sit down for formal questioning. 4 months. During those months, the only way police could ask questions was through written submissions. They would fax questions to the Ramsey attorneys. The attorneys would review them with John and Patsy. Then the attorneys would send back written responses. That's not how innocent people behave. Innocent people cooperate. They sit down with police immediately. They answer every question, volunteer information, beg investigators to do whatever it takes to find out what happened. But the Ramseys erected a legal wall between themselves and the investigation. They hired Hal Haddon, one of the most prominent defense attorneys in Colorado. Haddon had a reputation for aggressive defense, for protecting his clients at all costs. His strategy, as he would later describe in interviews, was to win the case outside the courtroom, to manage the narrative publicly, to create enough doubt, enough alternative theories, enough mud in the water that prosecution would become impossible. And it worked. But here's what that strategy tells us. The Ramseys weren't focused on finding out who was responsible for their daughter's passing. They were focused on protecting themselves from being blamed. Those are two very different priorities. And the choice they made, to lawyer up immediately, to refuse cooperation, to control information, that choice tells us they knew something. They knew they were at risk. They knew the investigation would lead toward them. And they were preparing to fight. From a philosophical standpoint, this moment is when the case transforms. It's no longer just about finding out what happened to JonBenet. It becomes about power, about control, about wealthy, connected people using resources to shape reality. The truth becomes secondary to the narrative. And the Ramseys had the money, the connections, and the legal firepower to control that narrative for decades. Act 4. The Victim. Before we go any further, we need to talk about who JonBenet Ramsey was. Because in all the chaos, in all the forensic details and legal maneuvering and theories, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this was a 6-year-old child. A little girl with blonde hair and bright eyes who loved performing, loved being on stage, loved making people smile. JonBenet was born on August 6, 1990. She came into a family that already had complexities, histories, dynamics that shaped who she would become. John Ramsey was her father, a successful businessman, CEO of Access Graphics, a company that had recently grossed over $1 billion in revenue. John was on his second marriage. His first marriage to Lucinda Pash had produced 3 children, Elizabeth, Melinda, and John Andrew. Elizabeth had been gone in a car accident in 1992, just a few years before JonBenet's passing. That kind of loss changes a family in ways that are hard to quantify. Grief doesn't just disappear. It reshapes relationships, creates sensitivities, leaves scars that never fully heal. John was described by those who knew him as controlled, disciplined, intelligent. A Navy veteran who approached life with strategic thinking. He was wealthy, successful, prominent in Boulder's business community. But there was also a distance to him. People who worked with John described him as hard to read, someone who kept his emotions close. Patsy Ramsey was JonBenet's mother. And Patsy's influence on JonBenet's life was profound. Patsy had been Miss West Virginia in 1977. Beauty pageants were woven into her identity. She understood performance, presentation, the work it takes to create an image. And when JonBenet showed an aptitude for performing, Patsy dove in with full intensity. By age 6, JonBenet had competed in numerous pageants. She had elaborate costumes, sequin dresses, tiaras, makeup. She had choreographed routines. She sang, danced, posed for judges. To the outside world, she looked like a miniature adult, polished, poised, professional. And Patsy documented everything. Photos, videos, albums full of memories. JonBenet on stage, JonBenet winning crowns, JonBenet smiling for the camera. From an anthropological perspective, this tells us something about the family's values. Image mattered. Presentation mattered. Success in public arenas mattered. But what was happening when the cameras were off? People who knew JonBenet personally described her as sweet, energetic, sometimes shy. She loved her family. She adored her older brother Burke. She wanted to please her parents, wanted to make them proud. But there were also signs that the pressure of performance was taking a toll. JonBenet had persistent bedwetting issues. This wasn't unusual for a child her age. Many kids struggle with nighttime control. But it was chronic enough that Patsy mentioned it to doctors, to friends, to family. Sometimes JonBenet would wake up in a wet bed and, rather than wake her parents, she'd wander to Burke's room and sleep in his bed. Or she'd change herself, clean up, and go back to sleep. From a psychological perspective, this behavior suggests a child who was trying to manage her own problems, who didn't want to be a burden, who'd learned not to ask for help with certain things. And then there's the detail that the family never wanted to discuss publicly: JonBenet's history of vaginal issues. She'd had multiple instances of vaginal irritation, chronic enough that Patsy took her to the doctor several times. The diagnosis was usually vaginitis, inflammation that Patsy attributed to bubble baths, to improper wiping, to normal childhood causes. But pediatricians don't typically see chronic vaginal issues in a 6-year-old unless something else is happening. The autopsy would later reveal evidence of both chronic and acute vaginal injury. Chronic meaning long-term, repeated. Acute meaning recent, that night. We'll come back to this detail, because it becomes central to understanding what happened. For now, what we need to know is this: JonBenet was a child living in a family with specific pressures, specific dynamics, specific expectations. Her brother Burke was 9 years old, quiet, sometimes withdrawn. By multiple accounts, he seemed to exist in the shadow of his charismatic younger sister. Where JonBenet was outgoing and performed for attention, Burke was internal, reserved. The family projected an image of success. Wealthy businessman, former beauty queen, 2 beautiful children, a mansion in Boulder, country club memberships, the American dream realized. But behind that image, there were tensions. John had experienced profound loss with Elizabeth's passing. Patsy had survived ovarian cancer just a few years earlier, a battle that left her determined to live life fully, intensely, as if making up for lost time. And the children were navigating their own relationship. Burke as the older brother who'd been the baby of the family until JonBenet arrived. JonBenet as the younger sibling who seemed to command more attention, more focus, more energy from their mother. These dynamics matter, because families are systems. And when something goes wrong in a system, you have to understand the whole structure to understand how it happened. On Christmas Day 1996, the Ramseys had a full day. They attended a party at Fleet and Priscilla White's home. JonBenet played with other children. Burke played with his friends. The adults socialized, exchanged gifts, celebrated the holiday. By all accounts, it was a normal, happy gathering. The family left the party around 8:45 or 9 p.m. They drove home. The children were tired. It had been a long day of Christmas excitement, party activities, playing with new toys. What happened next is where the stories begin to diverge. According to John and Patsy, they arrived home around 9 or 9:15 p.m. John carried JonBenet from the car. She was asleep, zonked out from the long day. He carried her upstairs to her room. Patsy helped get her ready for bed, changed her out of her party clothes. They put her to bed. Burke went to his room. John and Patsy went to their room. Everyone went to sleep. That's the official timeline. But there are problems with it. Details that don't quite fit. Burke would later admit, in a 2016 interview with Dr. Phil, that he didn't go straight to bed. He went back downstairs to play with a toy he'd gotten for Christmas. He doesn't say how long he was down there. He doesn't say if anyone else was awake. But he was downstairs, alone, in the middle of the night. And at some point, during those dark hours, something happened. Something that would end JonBenet's life. Something the family has spent 29 years trying to obscure, trying to explain away, trying to hide behind legal walls and alternative theories. But the evidence doesn't lie. The physical evidence, the forensic evidence, the behavioral evidence, it all points in one direction. And that direction isn't toward a stranger who broke in from the cold Colorado night. It's toward someone who was already in the house. Someone who knew JonBenet. Someone who knew the layout, knew the family, knew exactly how to make this look like something it wasn't. Ending. So let's take stock of where we are. Within hours of that 911 call, The crime scene was destroyed. Evidence was contaminated beyond recovery. The body was moved, handled, repositioned. Friends and family had trampled through every room, touched every surface, created an investigative nightmare. And the people who should have been most desperate for answers, the parents, the family members, anyone who might have information, were hiding behind lawyers. Before the body was even found, the Ramseys had legal representation. Before the sun set on December 26th, they'd stopped talking to police. And in the days and weeks and months that followed, they would control the narrative. They'd appear on television, grant carefully scripted interviews, present themselves as grieving parents, victimized by a monster who came in the night. But the evidence tells a different story. No forced entry, no disturbance at any window or door, no evidence of an intruder navigating the house in the dark. A ransom note written on paper from inside the home, using a pen from inside the home, demanding an amount that matched John's Christmas bonus exactly. A ransom note that warned against calling police, yet the family called police immediately. A promised ransom call that never came, and a family that didn't seem surprised by its absence. A body found in the basement, in a room that had been latched from the outside, after being in the house for over 7 hours while everyone claimed she'd been taken. Lawyers arriving before anyone knew what they were really dealing with. A legal strategy focused not on finding the truth, but on creating reasonable doubt. This wasn't a kidnapping gone wrong. This was something else entirely. And the evidence they tried to hide, the details they tried to bury under legal motions and public relations campaigns and decades of misdirection. It's been waiting for someone to look past the performance, past the tears, past the carefully constructed narrative of the intruder in the night. It's been waiting 29 years to tell the truth. In the next episode, we're going to do something no one has done comprehensively before. We're going to take that ransom note, the one piece of evidence the Ramseys couldn't destroy, couldn't contaminate, couldn't make disappear, and we're going to tear it apart, line by line, word by word, phrase by phrase, because that note isn't a ransom demand. It's a window into the mind of whoever wrote it. And when you understand what's really in those 2.5 pages, the whole case cracks open. We're going to look at the handwriting analysis that points to Patsy. We're going to examine the linguistic patterns that reveal someone trying to sound like a criminal but failing. We're going to trace the movie references, the odd phrasings, the details that only someone in the family would know. The ransom note is where this case breaks wide open, because whoever wrote it left fingerprints all over it. Not literal fingerprints, though we'll talk about those too. Psychological fingerprints, linguistic markers, evidence of who they are, what they know, what they were trying to accomplish. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This is just the beginning. The truth has been buried for 29 years under wealth, legal maneuvering, and carefully crafted lies. But evidence doesn't care about money. It doesn't care about lawyers. It doesn't care about public image. Evidence just is. And the evidence in this case has been screaming the same thing since December 26, 1996. The person responsible for JonBenet's passing didn't come from outside that house. They were already inside. They've been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades. And we're going to find them.